solemnly swore an oath to God to protect his name, his followers, and his kingdom. The military orders of the Crusades answered the call when threat of annihilation was hanging in the balance. In an all-new series, James and Joanna Bogle discuss the heroic efforts of the defense of ancient Christendom.
Europe is attacked from the north, from the south, from the east, and from the northeast as well. We really, literally had attacks on all sides.
So arose the military orders and the Crusades, an all-new series here on the Global Catholic Network, EWTN.
Hello, I'm Joanna Bogle, and with my husband Jamie, together we're exploring the military orders and the Crusades. Today we're going to discuss the Knights Templar, whom we've already met in an earlier episode, discovering their magnificent defence of the Holy Land. But what happened next? Today we're going to look at the Knights Templars' departure from the Holy Land and their suppression. So, Jamie, it's a rather ghastly story, isn't it? Let's backtrack first to the Crusades, the establishment of the Latin Kingdom of Jerusalem, and the role of the Templars as defenders of that kingdom.
Well, that's right. And if we remember, back in 1291, we saw the fall of Acre, and the last of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, and the last of the Crusader involvement in that kingdom. We still had some Crusader states, but gradually they were taken over by Islam and eventually defeated. One is often presented with an image of the Crusades as a kind of colonial expedition force sent out by European colonial powers, rather like in the 19th century. Nothing could be further from the truth. This was a very different sort of operation, largely defensive against the Muslim invasions, as we have seen. And the thing to remember is that although they initially succeeded in recovering the Holy Land, which had been under Christian control for all of its history up to that date under the Eastern Byzantine Empire, ultimately they did not succeed. The Latin Kingdom of Jerusalem lasted for only 100 years, and by 1291 the Crusaders had been defeated. So not much of an expeditionary force or a colonial power if they weren't able to maintain themselves beyond that time period.
It's important for us to grasp this, I think. In the modern era, I think for a long while people did know that and it was understood. But in the modern era, we're told somehow that the Crusaders were extremely vainglorious, perhaps greedy, and that it all lasted for ages and ages and was a sort of, as you say, a colonial expedition. But it's absolutely not true. The tragic reality of the Crusades is we in the sense of the Christians, lost.
Indeed. And ironically, the idea of it being a colonial expedition became so prominent after the 18th century, and the Enlightenment and anti-Christian viewpoint being generally peddled, that the idea of it as a kind of 19th century colonial invasion was sold to Muslim world itself, and they began to believe the Western propaganda. And much of a modern view by Islamic thinkers and politicians and others is based upon their acceptance of what effectively was a myth. So teaches the expert on the Crusades, Professor Jonathan Riley-Smith, and I think he's got a point.
He's almost amusing about it. He says the 19th century liked to rewrite the Crusades in terms of their own understanding of what had been done in the 19th century in Africa, the building of the British Empire and so on. So they saw the Crusades in that light, and as you say, sold that idea in that sense to the Islamic world, who now say it back to us. I mean, it's almost funny, really, given that it's 100% wrong, and they think that's what we still think, if you follow my meaning.
I do.
There's something rather absurd about that and rather tragic.
And in addition to that, we've also got the final history of the Templars, about which there are as many myths as there are true facts. The reality of the story is actually more interesting than the received myth. We have to remember that by 1300, when there was some attempt by the Templars to engage in a coordinated military effort with, surprisingly enough, the Mongols, who were all the time threatening the Muslim world from the east, as the Turks had, and they were planning to make this alliance in order to invade Al-Wad. And in 1302 or 1303, they gained a foothold, but the Egyptian Mamluks, remember the Mamluks were Muslim captured slaves who were then turned into Muslim soldiers, yes. And they themselves became powerful in their own right. And they, in fact, then forced the Templars off their gains at Al-Wad, at the siege of Al-Wad. And with that island gone, the Crusaders finally lost their last foothold in the Holy Land. And the position then became difficult for the Templars and the Hospitallers. We saw how the Hospitallers dealt with it, but the Templars were left slightly high and dry because their aim, of course, was to defend the frontiers of Christendom in the Holy Land. They still needed to defend the frontiers, but exactly where they were going to do that was not easy. And the situation was complex because over 200 years of their existence, the Templars had become part, more or less, of the daily life of Christendom, because there were temples, Templar estates all throughout Christendom. Templar houses, hundreds of them dotted throughout Europe and the Near East. And that, of course, gave them tremendous widespread influence at the local level. They managed businesses, they had daily contact with many Europeans, Christians, who worked in their lands. They weren't subject to local government. They were, if you like, a kind of state within a state with its own standing army. Yet they had no longer a well-defined mission predicated upon the Holy Land.
And these were the men who had been the epitome of the Crusader Knights. These are the figures we see one above us, above the fireplace on the mantelpiece. These are the knights with the red cross on the white background. They are the epitome, really, of the Crusades. So, with their banking and their other power and influence across Europe, perhaps they also attracted a massive amount of envy.
They did. As inevitably happens when you accumulate a great deal of wealth and power, you make inadvertently enemies who simply envy your wealth and status and power, even if it's being employed for a good cause. And one such was King Phillip IV of France, in fact a grandson of the great Saint Louis, who had fought in the 7th and 8th Crusades in Egypt and Damietta, and who had even entered into alliances where appropriate with the Islamic kingdoms, now produced a grandson who was of a very different stamp of mind. If you consider that at the same time there was a move afoot, and to some extent supported by the Pope, to join the two great orders, the Templars and the Hospitallers, at the same time the Templars were looking for a way of founding their own monastic state, as later the Teutonic Knights did in Prussia, and the Knights Hospitaller were doing in Rhodes, as we've seen, and later in Malta. So there was a lot of flux of ideas. This was an opportunity for an unscrupulous king like Philip the Fourth, so-called Philip the Fair, meaning good-looking, because he was certainly not fair in his dealings, to seize the opportunity to advance his own cause. Now we have to remember at the time that he had been at war with England, and he owed the Templars, from whom he had borrowed a great deal of money, huge sums, and therefore he had a reason to be at enmity with the Templars. They had no inkling of this. They had no idea that he was going to behave in this way. But in due course, it became quite clear that that's what he was going to do. He used this as an excuse for a campaign which had nothing less than the aim of suppressing the entire Templar order. The Templars, who had been the most committed and zealous of defenders of the faith, of the Church, of Christendom, of the boundaries of Christendom, were now to be attacked by one of the Christian kings themselves, out of nothing really much more than simple greed and cupidity. He was a very greedy man, but also he had the problem that he owed the Templars a great deal of money. But what he needed was a pretext, because of the immensely privileged position of the Templars as the kind of if you like, police force or state troopers of the whole of Christendom. Well, in the same way that you couldn't suppress the entirety of the FBI or the state troopers or the police force simply because you wanted their money. You had to find an excuse, a legal excuse, as to why they should be suppressed by the authorities, ultimately, I suppose, by the Pope. And this he needed in order to justify his course, so that he would get the sanction of the Church in seizing, in suppressing the Templars and seizing their property. This is what he was after. And
there were also tensions that he was able to use within the Church. Well, as you've indicated, it would have to be the Church which suppressed them. You can sort of understand this. A successful group, imagine someone who hated EWTN, and its perhaps considerable influence in the media, managing to denounce it for modernism or something within the Church. It would have no basis, but it would be quite a clever way of doing it, even if one's motives were base, or even if one's motives were mixed.
Well, indeed. Now, let's also remember there's another complicating factor within this whole picture as it envelops, and that is the enmity that had been occasioned by Philip IV, by Philip the Fair, against the papacy. Because this was the time when you had, rather like harking back to the investiture contest of the late 1000s, you had now some of the kings flexing their muscles and even purporting to be able to exercise spiritual and temporal jurisdiction beyond the power of the papacy, a kind of precursor, if you like, of King Henry VIII. Philip the Fair, if anything, was an example of that. He had had a major falling out with Boniface VIII and had said to Boniface VIII that he wasn't subject to his power. Boniface VIII fought back and they had a major falling out. And thereafter we see that when Boniface died, a new Pope, Clement V, who was a Frenchman, was prevailed upon to remove the papacy from Rome to Avignon. And you have the Avignon schism, which gave the French kings and indeed French nobles considerable power over the Pope. So this was part of the background as well. So you have emerging a kind of Henry VIII figure. What Philip did was he set up a preliminary inquiry on the strength of supposed revelations from a few unworthy, degraded members of the Templar order. And secret orders were sent throughout the whole of France to arrest all of the Templars on the very same day, 13th of October, 1307, and to submit them to a rigorous examination. Let's not forget as well that Philip had 7 years earlier done the very same thing with the Jews of France. He had arrested them all on one day and seized their lands and property, which were considerable, and expelled them from France. You were already beginning to get a flavour of what this chap Philip was really like. Now, in the inquiry, the Templars were subjected to brutal and pitiless torture to make them confess, contrary to the laws of the Church and of the land, and indeed of the exhortations of the early Church Fathers who spoke against such methods. But there was no evidence against them. And so the only thing that Philip could do, well, there was no evidence because they hadn't done anything wrong. So what he had to do was to extort confessions.
How horrible.
And he did that by torturing them, to extract confessions. There was one particular feature of the Templar order which gave rise to, shall we say, an opportunity for Philip to raise a particular pretext, and that was their rites of initiation, which were conducted in chapter, and the chapter was always held in secret. The reason it was held in secret is because the Templars had a lot of very confidential political business to discuss, being the confidence of kings and emperors and popes, and having to defend the frontiers of Christendom. It would be rather like saying that to say that they shouldn't have had it in secret would be rather like saying that the presidential situation room, where confidential discussions about military engagements of the United States ought to be open to the public. This would manifestly be foolish.
Well, we have the same system in England. The very expression Privy Council means the secret council of the monarch. Yes, the secret cabinet session, as it were.
Well, because at the same time as chapters were being undertaken, the initiation took place, in which it was simply the solemn ceremonies of the Church. This enabled Philip to put it about that all sorts of untoward ceremonies took place, blasphemies, sexual misconduct, sodomy even, witchcraft, sorcery, and so on went on, where there was no evidence of that at all. And the more that this subject has been studied over the years, the more it has become clear that there was no evidence at all for any of the accusations made by Philip. And let us not forget also that Philip had made similar sorts of accusations against Pope Boniface VIII. So, anyone with an objective eye can see that what he was up to was no good, really. The mere fact that he made so many accusations against the Templars itself ought to raise a suspicion in our minds. Methinks he doth protest too much about the Templar order. Nevertheless, that is what he did. And they were accused of spitting on the cross, denying Christ, permitting sodomy, worshipping an idol, all in secrecy, but no evidence. Only evidence produced was extorted confessions. And even the Pope of the day, although he felt that he ought to institute his own inquiry because certain Templars were forced by Philip to confess to him, nonetheless, in due course, exonerated the Templars. And this is something which is always left out of the story.
But it's a rather ghastly thing because, of course, most of us would say anything under torture.
Well, quite. But interestingly, the Pope of the day, who was to some extent a creature of the King of France, Clement V, in the so-called Babylonish captivity in Avignon, away from Rome, under the influence of French kings, himself heavily pressured, threatened by Philip the Fair, the Unfair, perhaps we should call him. Nevertheless, in the end, he exonerates. Knowing that he himself could be threatened, he exonerates the Templars. He does suppress the Templar order, eventually, but this is because he feels he's forced into a compromise. So he can say, well, I find nothing against them, but I will nonetheless suppress them.
This is sometimes the realpolitik in the church as in the state, isn't it?
Yes. But I think also left out of the equation is that Philip himself made similar accusations, as I say, against Pope Boniface VIII. And indeed, historians have suggested that Philip was on the point of separating the French church from Rome, as Henry VIII, of course, was later to do. The accused Templars were so ferociously tortured by King Philip that the confessions in due course were obtained, and the Grand Master himself, Jacques de Molay, the last, in fact, Grand Master, himself made a confession which he later claimed he had been forced into, and which was entirely false. So what happened then was that without the authorization of the Pope, who nonetheless was, of course, had the military orders under his immediate jurisdiction, there being no intermediate between him and the military orders, this investigation was radically corrupted, both in procedure and in intent. Clement V entered an energetic protest. He even annulled the entire trial, suspended the French bishops and their inquisitors from carrying out any such investigations, but nonetheless King Philip proceeded on the basis of the extorted confessions, and he even used the process to aggrandize himself with the powers in France, the universities and the local estates general, who awarded him various grand titles, Defender of the Faith and so on. And he managed thereby to avoid his debts, to secure all the property of the Templars, and as I say, to get some of the Templars to confess before the Pope, so that the Pope himself felt he had to institute an inquiry of his own.
So it's a rather ghastly story, and it gets worse, doesn't it, with the fate of the final Grand Master. And there's something sort of tragic about this, perhaps a little bit echoing also the suppression of the Jesuits much later on. And it's a proof, if proof were needed, that even within the church down the centuries, dreadful things can happen. And it's a particular tragedy when it's healthy groups that have done a great deal of good within the
Well, it does tend to be the more zealous orders of the church. Jesuits being another example, and a very apposite one, I think. Because of their zeal in making converts or in defending the church, they're the ones whom the enemies of the church focus their attention on most strongly. And in some cases, because the nature of the fallen world we live in, they succeed, and they even manage to put pressure on bishops and popes, councils, kings, to suppress or do away with or limit the good effect of these orders. And the Templars is one classic example.
It's a particularly tragic one because it was physical, appalling suffering, as well as the sort of actual injustice, loss of lands, loss of money, loss of the status and so on. There's a particular tragedy.
Yes, indeed. Well, what also happened, of course, although, Philip's jurisdiction, and we have to remember that Christian kings were powerful individuals. We're not used to this these days because we don't have any Christian or Catholic kingdoms that to speak of. Most of our modern kingdoms are either indifferent or neutral or actively secularist. But when there were Christian kingdoms, they were very powerful people, and they could use their powers for good or ill. Of course, they would be then disciplined or even excommunicated by the spiritual arm, but that wasn't always entirely successful. Now, having persuaded the Pope by these false confessions that there might be something in it, the Pope then had to come to, he had to run his own inquiry and then come to a kind of compromise, because, as I say, he was himself threatened and pressured by King Philip of France, and that is, he decided that he would suppress the Templar order, not just in France, but throughout the whole world. At the same time, that he felt gave him the opportunity to declare definitively that there was nothing in the accusations against him. Seems a little odd, therefore, that he should suppress an order against whom there was no successful conviction or accusation. But this was the kind of, as you say, the realpolitik of the time. You
can see exactly how that could play out in modern terms, and I gave the rather ghastly example, which heaven forfend, of somebody deciding that they hated EWTN. You can imagine it is in the nature of the ghastly political life of a fallen world. But please tell us what happened to the Pope, perhaps.
Interestingly, in other countries, they had similar trials as happened in France. But in most other countries, Portugal, Spain, Germany, Cyprus, the Templars were all found completely innocent. There were no accusations upheld against them, although there were plenty of accusations. In Italy, except for a few districts, the decision was the same. It was only in France that the Episcopal Inquisition, resuming its activities despite the prohibitions of the Pope, took as established the facts that had been proclaimed at the French trial, even though the proceedings had been annulled by the Pope, and assumed that evidence was valid, and confined themselves to reconciling the repentant, supposedly guilty members of the Templar order, and they imposed upon them very severe canonical penances and life sentences. Problem was that having accepted this evidence, even though, as I say, the trial had been annulled by the Pope, and there was nothing in these, they had to deal with the supposed retractations of confessions. And this gave King Philip the opportunity that he was searching for to get rid of the leaders of the Order of the Temple. 54 Templars who recanted after having confessed were condemned by the French tribunal as relapsed, and they were, having been charged with heresy, or they were charged therefore as relapsed heretics, which gave the tribunal, a lay tribunal, a secular tribunal, the opportunity of sending them to the stake, which they duly did. And on the 12th of May 1310, they were sent to the stake, including the Grand Master, Jacques de Molay, and the Grand Chancellor, Geoffrey de Charnay. They died bravely, as ever, and it was appropriate for a Templar, men of great courage. And the Grand Master himself summoned both King and Pope to the judgment seat of God, as he put it, whilst he was at the stake. And interestingly, within a year, both King and Pope had died, and they were indeed summoned to that judgment seat. Subsequently, as I say, all the other Templars who'd been examined at trial, with very few exceptions, thereafter declared themselves guilty, because they feared to be treated in the same way as having been relapsed. And so the order was then suppressed. Templars who had been members of the Temple order joined the Hospitallers or other orders. Some of them were dispensed back into secular life and given pensions. But the vast majority, wanted to continue the crusading and military orders principle, and so joined other crusading orders.
And so thus was born, out of the tragedy, the legend of the Templars, which, as we've mentioned in earlier episodes, has given rise to all sorts of stuff about, buried gold and all the gibberish of paperback books and people who claim to be the descendants of the Templars and so on, precisely because of this tragic end.
That's correct. Interestingly, the General Council of Vienne in Dauphiné on the 16th of October 1311, the majority of the bishops were favourable to the order continuing, but nonetheless, as we've seen, that by a bull on the 22nd of March 1312, they were suppressed and their property handed over to the order of Hospitallers, except of course in places like France where the king merely seized their property. In Portugal and in Aragon, they were in fact vested in two new orders, the Order of Christ in Portugal and the Order of Montesa in Aragon. But apart from that, they had disappeared and were not ever to be seen again, although attempts have been made to resurrect them in various spurious forms. And
in Britain, certainly in London, the Temple Church passed into the hands of the legal profession and remains to this day part of the legal Inns of Court. The Temple Church, which can be visited and where you can see Crusaders buried, and it's at the heart of legal London, the Middle Temple, the Inner Temple.
Indeed so.
And it's where you work.
It is, yes.
That's where the lawyers all work.
Indeed.
We're winding up shortly, so we'll just finish us quickly with the story of the Templars.
Well, let me
give... It's a very sad one.
It is, and it marked a sea change in the history of Christendom, because thereafter the powers of the papacy were weakened by the way in which Clement V had behaved. And let's remember what Phillip le Bel had written to Pope Boniface VIII. He wrote, "Your venerable stupidness may know that we are nobody's vassal in temporal matters." And this is the way in which this king, who had caused the downfall of a great order, behaved towards the spiritual authorities of the church. I think it's indicative, and I think it gives a new light, perhaps, to people who are used to hearing a rather different story of the suppression of the Knights Templar.
We've been looking at the Knights Templar in our exploration of the military orders and the Crusades. In the next episode, we'll be looking at the Knights of Malta, the continuing story of the Knights of St. John, from Rhodes to the Siege of Malta.